I was invited 2 weeks ago to a sort of extraordinary conference that civilians don't often get to attend. I was invited as a guest speaker to the United States Naval War College in Rhode Island. I was the only civilian at a conference of almost 200 military lawyers. It's not the normal place I hang out. These are JAG officers. Many of them are in the reserves. Some of them are very high-ranking military officials who in their civilian lives do things like serve as senior prosecutors at the Department of Justice, are legal counsel at the Central Intelligence Agency. I was allowed to attend briefings on cyber warfare, on fourth-generational warfare, which is asymmetric warfare, where uniformed national armies are fighting against groups of militants and people that are designated by the United States State Department as terrorists or terrorist organizations around the world, the main battlefields that we see in the globe today. And one of the people that spoke was the lieutenant general who is in charge of what are called rule of law operations in Iraq. He is the official that is overseeing the legality of U.S. military operations there, but also helping to establish Iraqi legal institutions. And he spent the better part of the last 5-6 years going in and out of Iraq. And he started his presentation at the War College by asking this room full of people, how many of you have been in Iraq or Afghanistan? And almost everyone raised their hand. And he said, how many of you believe that combat operations are over in Iraq? Not a single person in that room raised their hands. And I spent the weekend talking with people who serve in the United States military that are in Iraq. Not a single one of them believes the rhetoric that we've been seeing. In fact, they chastised the media for creating an event that was essentially a false event, where there was some whiff of a declaration of victory without actually putting it into words from the commander-in-chief that sort of surrounded the U.S. Scale down in Iraq or drawdown in Iraq. I bring that up because I think that one of the sober realities is that the United States is not going to be leaving Iraq anytime soon, and certainly not within the first term of the Obama administration. What we've seen is a downsizing and a rebranding of the Iraq occupation under this president. The plan that's been implemented in Iraq was not President Obama's. It was the plan that was, in fact, on the desk of President Bush when he left office. And what is happening is that we have these 50,000 troops that are there, but we also have 90,000 contractors. We have an embassy that is the size of 80 football fields. It's the size of Vatican City. The Vatican has embassies around the world. We have an embassy the size of the Vatican. We have the Pizza Huts and the Dunkin' Donuts and an obesity problem plaguing troops and contractors alike because of the kind of permanent state that we've built there. But what we're seeing is a ratcheting up of the privatization of war under President Obama, and it's really an unfortunate trend that we're seeing. Last month, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton asked the Congress for a doubling of the armed contractor presence in Iraq as a result of the drawdown of some of the conventional forces or the combat forces. And so there's a paramilitarization of the State Department that's happening under this administration. In the meantime, in Afghanistan, we have a situation where there's almost a 2-to-1 ratio of private contractors to uniformed U.S. soldiers. There are about 140,000 contractors in Afghanistan right now alongside 100,000 U.S. troops, so it's about a 1.5-to-1 ratio. And the estimate from the Congressional Budget Office is that there's going to be about 160,000 contractors by the end of this year in Afghanistan. It's the most radically privatized war in our history. While we're seeing these conventional wars continue to play out in the media, unfortunately not enough in U.S. media, it does play out around the world, there's another much more secret and covert war that the president has launched in his 2 years in office, and that is through the use of special operations forces, highly trained, what are essentially hit teams made up of Navy SEAL Team 6, the Delta Force, the 160th Aviation Division out of Fort Campbell in Kentucky, the most highly trained and sophisticated elite killer teams that we have in the United States. And they are not just operating in Afghanistan and Iraq. In Afghanistan, they have 2,000 people on a kill list that they're hunting on a daily basis. Many of them, according to sources we've talked to at The Nation, are mid to low-level Taliban people whose only reason for fighting is because we are there. So those are the people overwhelmingly that we're fighting. General Jones, the National Security Advisor, estimates that there are less than 200 and closer to 100 al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan today. But away from those battlefields, the president has authorized an expansion of special operations forces into countries far away from Afghanistan and Iraq. The president has taken special operations forces from 60 countries under President Bush, where U.S. special forces are operating, to 75. We are conducting what are called kinetic operations in Yemen. In other words, we're killing people on the ground in Yemen. There's no declaration of war against Yemen, and this is not something you see often on TV. We're all over the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, as well as in Latin America. This is all the result of an execute order that was issued by General Petraeus last September that authorized U.S. forces to go outside of the declared battlefields and into these countries to literally hunt people down. There are some parallels between President Obama and President Kennedy in terms of the way that they've embraced the Special Operations Forces. The sources that I have within the Special Forces community love President Obama. And the reason, and Katrina and I have talked about this a lot, is because President Obama is giving them a legal authority to do things that were sort of given in hallways by Dick Cheney permission for under the Bush-Cheney administration, where Cheney would literally say to General McChrystal, I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and there would be no paper trail to ensure that what the troops were doing was legal. So in a way, Obama has sort of legalized some of the most unsavory aspects of the Bush and Cheney foreign policy, and I think this is something that we have to examine much more carefully, and hopefully we can talk about in the question and answer. The final thing that I want to talk about is that I think a really disturbing aspect of the Obama doctrine, if you will, is that this president has publicly authorized the intent to assassinate a United States citizen without due process. Anwar alAwlaki, I'm sure, is a terrible human being. I've watched his videos. I think what he says is despicable. He's a man that probably deserves to be hauled in front of a court and tried for the crimes that he's been involved with. It should be a law enforcement activity. But instead, the president has authorized the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command to conduct a targeted killing of this man who's believed to be in Yemen. When Congressman Dennis Kucinich introduced legislation to challenge this, only 5 members of Congress would join him in saying, I don't believe that we have a right to kill U.S. citizens without due process if they are not engaged in direct hostilities against the United States, which alAwlaki is not. He's not taking up arms. He's encouraging others to do it. That's a crime. He's an American citizen. He should be prosecuted for that crime. So we have this reality where this president, for all practical purposes, is conducting a foreign policy when it comes to the war parts of it. I mean, General Gard and Stephen may have a different take on some other aspects of his foreign policy. But when it comes to direct action, war policy, there's very little difference between what President Obama is doing on a policy level and what we saw happen during the Bush and Cheney era, except that he seems to be expanding some of those unsavory operations and giving them more of a legal stamp. And I want to leave you with a quote from a lawsuit that was filed against Donald Rumsfeld and 22 other military officials on behalf of the families of individuals that died at Guantanamo. Their families sued Rumsfeld and the others in U.S. courts seeking justice for the deaths of these people. Attorney General Eric Holder intervened in this case on behalf of Donald Rumsfeld and the others. And he said that instead of Rumsfeld and the others being the defendants, the United States government will replace them as the defendants in these cases. And because the government has sovereign immunity, the cases were dismissed. But in defending Donald Rumsfeld and the others, the Assistant Attorney General Tony West cited the Westfall Act, which was passed in the 80s as an amendment to the Federal Torts Claim Act that was intended to protect federal employees from being held liable for torts or crimes or wrongs that they committed during the course of their official duties. It was a way to insulate federal employees from being accountable for a crime that occurred while they were on their job. They're driving a mail truck, a wheel blows off of it, it flies into traffic, it kills someone. You don't sue the individual driving the car, the government assumes responsibility. But in defending this, Tony West, the Assistant Attorney General under Eric Holder, said, the type of activities alleged against the individual defendants, Rumsfeld and the others, were foreseeable. We're talking about the murder of prisoners at Guantanamo, and were a direct outgrowth of their responsibility to detain and gather intelligence from suspected enemy combatants. And he wrote, genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by individual defendants employed by the Department of Defense and State were within the scope of their employment. Genocide, torture, forced relocation, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment were within the scope of their employment. I think every American should be required to read that brief and understand that this was a document authored by the United States Justice Department under Attorney General Eric Holder. We have a lot of work to do in holding this president accountable for what continues to be unjust and probably extrajudicial policies that are being implemented around the globe. Thank you.